for joining us today for the fourth in our GeoTalks Express series. This is a little bit of a different setup today, a little bit of a different format, because in our previous sessions we had noticed that we were being inundated with questions, some of which we could answer, some of which unfortunately we weren't able to answer in real time. We decided, why don't we just have a dedicated question and answer session? And we opened up the email and the registration field to allow you to ask questions, and we got inundated with questions. We have many questions that we're going to answer today. Unfortunately, we will probably not have a chance to answer all of your questions. Rest assured that they all have been noted. We are going to be working through all of your questions, and we will be providing you with answers hopefully within the next week. We're going to get a direct response from us. We're also going to take the questions that you've asked, as we've done before, and collectively put them into one of our blog articles, and we'll distribute that to you folks as well. So eventually you'll get answers to all of the questions. But for today, we're going to touch on some of the questions that we were asked. I am joined today by two technical experts from the Blue Marble staff. Sitting on the sidelines, we have Jeff Hatzel, our Senior Application Specialist. Are you with us today, Jeff?
I am. Good morning, David.
Excellent.
How are you doing?
Good to have your expertise with us. And also Katrina Swikert, whose you've heard before in some of our previous webinars. Morning, Kat. Are you with us?
Good morning. I am.
Good to have you with us. Also joining us, we have Chris Berglund. Chris is our Vice President of Sales. Some of you already have been asking questions about licensing, so we invited Chris to join us so he could address some of those questions. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, everybody. How are you doing, David?
Excellent. Wow, we have the dream team with us today. This is excellent. We have a who's who of people in Blue Marble. So again, a little bit of a different format today. There is no structured agenda. We don't have a series of points we're going to follow. We're going to be throwing questions up on the slideshow, and I'm going to be throwing those questions over to Kat and Jeff and Chris, and also myself. I'll be answering some as well. You are in listen-only mode. This is a chance for you to obviously listen to the questions that they're asked and listen to the answers, but you have the opportunity, if you want to ask additional questions, to use that questions panel on the right-hand side. I've already noticed a few of you are asking questions already, so keep those coming in. We may have a chance to address some of those as well today, but if we don't, once again, we will follow up and provide answers to any questions that are being asked in the questions panel, again, hopefully within the next week. So over on the right side of your screen, you'll find that questions panel. The session is being recorded as previously. We'll have this video processed within the next day or so, and you'll at least get that to review some of the questions that we were addressing today. But again, by way of follow-up, we'll provide answers to all of your questions within the next week. A few things coming up on the agenda are upcoming GeoTalks Express sessions. We've got the snowball rolling here. It's kind of building momentum. We're seeing incredible interest from our existing users. We're also seeing a lot of interest from prospective users as well. So we're going to keep this going indefinitely. The next few that we're going to be rolling out next week, this time next week, I think it's afternoon Eastern time. So later in the day next week, we're going to be talking about Global Mapper Mobile. Jeff and I are going to do a session on the mobile application, including Global Mapper Mobile Pro. 2 weeks thereafter, we're going to be introducing the new functionality that has been released in the Geographic Calculator application. That release is imminent. We're working on the final bits and pieces of that application. It will be released soon, and we'll have a dedicated session talking about Geographic Calculator, as well as introducing to those of you who maybe are not familiar with that application exactly what it is. So look out for that one, May 27th. We're going to have a kind of a case study June 10th. We're going to be looking at lidar for archaeological research. We're going to bring in some guest speakers and actually look at a more practical application of some of the technology. So that is the plan for the next few weeks. For today, I should mention, if you want any more information on these sessions or the future GeoTalks Express sessions that we've organized, website is noted on the screen. You can also register for any of these, free registration. Go ahead and put your name down. You'll be guaranteed a slot. For today, questions. It's basically an open question time. Now, we're going to be switching back and forth between myself and my colleagues answering questions. I am going to begin. First question. Let me make sure we're get my PowerPoint. This is one that we get quite a lot, and we figured we'd start with a very simple one. This came in through the form that you would have filled in during registration. Someone asked a question if they add a polygon to a shapefile, common workflow. I have a shapefile, I want to put another feature in there, but it doesn't include the attributes. Do I have to add them manually is the question. So I'm going to quickly show a demonstration of that. So let me bring up the application. So here's a hypothetical scenario. We need to add an additional feature to this layer. I have my parcels, but I have a hole right here. I can use the digitizer and I can basically fill in this hole. If I initiate that process now, by the way, you'll notice snapping is enabled. I've got my little snap, my icon indicating it will snap to the existing line. If I hold the V key down, by the way, it will only snap to a vertex. So just to show you what would happen by default, I'm simply going to draw the additional polygon in here, and you will see when I complete that, this is the dialog box that pops up that confirms this polygon. That allows me to apply it to a specific layer. I would obviously put it in the same layer as the existing parcels, but you'll note the attribute table is blank. It's impractical to assign attributes manually. You could theoretically do that, but it's not very useful. So the alternative workflow, I'm going to cancel this. The alternative workflow, if this is something you're interested in doing, is first of all to select one of the existing features in the layer. Now, just to show what attribution is there already, I'm going to use my info tool. I'm going to select one of the existing polygons, and you'll note there's an extensive list of attributes that are assigned to each of these existing features. By selecting one of these with the digitizer, highlighting it, I can then initiate the process I showed you before. Again, we'll quickly, holding my V key down so I snap just to the vertices, I'm going to fill this hole in very cleanly here. Right-click to finish. Again, assigning it to the appropriate layer. I can use the settings from a selected feature. This button you see where my cursor is located will automatically populate the attribute table, so I don't have to do it manually. It's even inherited the color. So basically it takes all of the characteristics of the feature I've selected and applies these to this new feature. Now, obviously the values themselves have not been applied. You wouldn't want that. We can manually edit these. So region, for instance, we can go in and we can populate this with whatever relevant information. But at least I don't have to create the attribute fields themselves. Now, I'll go ahead and do this. Obviously blank, these are blank. We'll just go ahead and add my polygon. I forget which one I added here. I believe it was this one. No, it wasn't. It was the one next door, sorry. There we go. Yeah, you can see now we have attributes, but they're completely empty. At least we have saved ourselves a lot of work by choosing a feature beforehand before we initiate the digitizing process. So very simple little workflow. That's how we can assign the attributes without having to do it manually. Our next question, moving into kind of the lidar field. This is one we get a lot as well. With our building and ground extraction parameters, some people have problems with certain settings. The question we get, what are the right settings? Well, there are no right settings, but we can give you some recommendations. Jeff, I believe you're going to share some information about this one.
Yeah, sure, David.
Let me give you the screen so you can show everyone here. Let me give you the screen.
It looks like we also just had a related question come in. Is it possible to export vector objects created from the lidar tool from a classified point cloud, which is right in touch with what you're about to show. So
yes, great. Thanks for bringing that up.
As well.
Yeah. So what we're looking at here is a lidar point cloud. Now, before we have the ability to extract any features, we'd want our point cloud to be classified. So that's been done already. And since we're looking at buildings here, we'll note that all of our building features are colored in orange based on classification. Our extraction tool to extract those features out of the application gives us a few different parameters. We'll see in this tool we can also extract trees, power lines, and power poles, but we're just focusing on buildings right now. There's a couple settings in here where we want to be able to grab the proper structure of the building that we want to be aware of. So our first setting is called the resolution to extract our buildings or trees at. What that allows us to control essentially is how the tool looks through the point cloud to find features, right? Where are my buildings and where do my trees exist? You may be familiar with a similar setting from some of our classification tools. Generally, when we set this value, we want to keep it on the smaller side. Now, smaller obviously is a loose term here. But the reason we say smaller, so in this case, I'm gonna leave mine at 1 point spacing. What that does for us is it allows us to find the edge of a finite feature easily, right? So a roof feature is gonna have a finite edge, or the side of a building or a tree structure. So we want to look searching in a smaller area. We're going to choose, obviously, to extract our building footprints. And in this case, I'm also going to choose to create separate areas for different features of the roof. And when I do that for a building, I have the ability to set 2 further options or parameters here. The first one allows me to adjust for angle differences in the roof. So at what certain degree value am I going to start to pull out different roof features? The second one here, then our adjacent plane value, that says if I have 2 roof features next to each other, how far apart do they have to be before I'm considering them separate roof features? I could also, if I wanted, create a building mesh or create sidewalls if I wanted to do so. This very bottom option, the simplification multiplier, that is a nice one to use because it allows us to smooth the edges of our buildings. As you can imagine, when lidar is, you're conducting a lidar scan, all the points from the lidar scanner may not perfectly align along the edge of the building. And so this allows us to smooth out that variability in the lidar. Our result from that process will look something similar to this. So I'll zoom into my area where I've extracted some buildings. We can see those outlines follow the structures on my screen here. By default, these are 3-dimensional features. And so anytime we just had that question come in about exporting them, these are already 3-dimensional vector features. They can be directly exported to any vector format that you would like. For example, our export option can be found under the layer menu. And so then when I choose to export those, I would have a variety of compatible features I may want to export to. I think that covers everything I wanted to talk about for that question. But as I look at this a little longer, it does mention ground, and we don't necessarily extract ground. That leads me to believe maybe someone was also referring to classification issues. So the only thing I will quickly point you towards there is that when you're classifying ground, if you see issues with large flat buildings, take a look at the setting that allows us to adjust for our building width. So that would be the very bottom setting in the ground classification tool. That is a newer option, so if you're running an older version of Global Mapper, you may not have that. But what this allows you to do is adjust for where you may have large buildings in your point cloud. All right, David, I think I'm all set here. Back to you.
Great, and again, questions are still coming in. We had one with apologies. We don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of detail, but we had one question about showing the 3D view. That would have been a 3D polygon that was generated. So obviously popping that up in 3D, it would have extruded those buildings. Try it for yourselves, folks, now that you know how it's done. If you're working with extracting buildings from point cloud, then pop it up in 3D and you'll see those are extruded. We had a question come in about break lines. Time permitting, we're going to have a quick demonstration on using break lines a little bit later. Again, keep those questions. We'll try to address the questions that are coming in real time. Back to the submitted questions. This is a simple one. How do I draw a circle of a specific radius? The circle tool in the toolbar allows you to basically create a circle by clicking and dragging, and you manually define the radius using that process. We get the question often, how do I do it if I know what the radius is? Katrina, I believe you're going to do a quick demo of this one, showing us how to draw a circle.
I am, yes, thanks, David. Are you seeing my right screen from me, actually?
Yeah, we're seeing you.
Yes, okay, great. Okay, so I've just got some data loaded here, some imagery. And what we're gonna use in this case is the range ring tool. You can do a similar thing with the buffer tool. But what this is gonna allow me to do is I'm just gonna drop a point here once I select that tool. And I can specify what that radius that I want is. In this case, I'll just do a 1 kilometer circle. You can also do multiple circles, so kind of a multi-ring buffer idea. and generate that circle. It is worth noting that it's hard for me to talk about measuring distance without also talking about the projection. So Global Mapper does have some smarts built into this. When you use the range ring tool as well as the buffer tool, it's actually going to default to using great circle distance. So if you were drawing a circle, say, in the whole world map, it is not going to actually come out looking like a circle if you're not projected. So kind of depending on your projection, but it is going to be actually accurately measuring that distance. If you are, a surveyor or somebody working in local grid space, you can go into the configuration and change that to use grid measurement. But yeah, depending on what you're doing, it is kind of defaulting to measuring in that 3D kind of spherical version of the world, so that we don't, incorporate that projection error into our measurement.
Okay, but on a local level, it's
covers it.
Not that significant. Thanks.
Yeah, on a local level, it's not a huge deal, but it's always worth talking about projection a little when you start talking about this.
It's inevitable. It's an inevitable. It's going to happen. Question came in on, can I view, isolate individual features in a layer? Yes. Take a look at the querying function. Run your query based on what parameters you want, and then obviously those can be isolated by either copying them to a new layer or individually symbolizing them. So a number of different options for that. Next question we're going to address. I'm going to throw this one over to Chris. Cost of Global Mapper, is that an annual fee, Chris, or can you describe a little bit what people get for their money, I guess?
Yeah, sure, David. We get that question a lot. Every purchase of Global Mapper is a perpetual license, and we have different license models that people can choose from that fits their way they want to use the software. And any purchase of Global Mapper perpetual license automatically includes 12 months of maintenance and support. So you have things like access to our technical support desk, and you can also get free upgrades to the software as we release them through our release cycle. So you have the option at the end of that 12 months to renew your maintenance and support, and you can continue on at a fraction of the purchase price. So you can definitely, and we strongly encourage folks to keep their software enrolled in maintenance and support so they can get continuous upgrades and things like that. So yeah.
Okay, great. And so obviously incentive here is, obviously new functionality is added on a continual basis, so it really does make sense to get the latest and greatest, not in terms of just new tools, but also in terms of performance. So yeah, thank you, Chris. And stay on the sideline. There may be other sales/licensing questions that come in. Let's move on. Let's see what our next question is. This is a grab bag here. Jeff, I'm going to throw this one over to you. Are there suggestions for processing or managing large lidar projects? I would assume large point clouds. For instance, the person asked the question mentioned an entire US county scale. Maybe we can just answer this one verbally. Do you have any recommendations as to how that should be done?
Sure, yeah, so there's a few things you can do there. This is actually a question we get very often, especially as people are starting to work with much larger point clouds. One of the first and most basic things you can do is that when you're getting ready to process that data, keep it stored on your C drive where Global Mapper is installed. That really helps speed things up right from the get-go. Global Mapper also has a format called the Global Mapper Package, or GMP format. You may have come across before. This is essentially a highly efficient and compressed format for use right within Global Mapper. So it can be very useful when working with large data sets to convert your data to GMP. You can then work with it in Global Mapper, and if you're done, you need to go back to LAS or LAZ. You can export back out to that format too. For some instances, if you're working with a lot of large lidar tiles, so maybe you have multiple files next to each other, creating a map catalog can be great. That allows you to control the display of the data based on your zoom level, so you're only seeing data visually on the screen at the proper zoom level you need to work with it. We have some thinning options as well, so you could choose to thin the data when you load it, or perhaps run one of the more advanced lidar thinning tools within the application to further thin the point cloud. And then one thing that's worth noting, new now in Global Mapper 21.1, the 2D view is now multi-threaded, so that render and display on screen should be a little quicker right from baseline.
Yeah, and we are continually improving the performance. I think that's one of the kind of on-scene things in Global Mapper is that with every release, the performance improvements allow you to work with much larger data sets. Obviously, lidar being an example, but also vector files of any type. So, thank you, Jeff. What about this one? Need to reproject 250 image tiles. Is the only way to do this to load, reproject, and export each one individually? Answer to that one is no. And I'm going to take this one, actually. Let me bring up the application very quickly here. So just so you know, if I was to load all 250 tiles into the application and simply go to the file menu and run an export, it would export a single file. That is the default behavior of Global Mapper. In other words, mosaicing happens by default. If you want to address individual files, again, 250 individual tiles, and you want to reproject them so you have 250 files output, the way that you're going to do that is from the batch convert reproject tool, which is right here in the file menu. It's like an application within an application. If you select this, you choose your input format. Mine is selected to JPEG 2000. All of the supported formats are available here. We then choose our output format. That may be the same. If you're simply reprojecting, you may output to JP2 as well. You don't have to convert as part of this process. Then you import your files. I think I have some files sitting on the sideline here. I do. I'm just going to grab a few of these just for illustration purposes. We'll go ahead and open those. These are added to my list. Obviously, if this was a more realistic application, we would have maybe 250 or 1,000 different tiles. The way that we would reproject is simply by specifying the output projection. You can change that. It will use the source projection by default, but if I want to use this tool specifically for reprojecting, I simply change the output projection, run the process, and I get 250 or however many tiles that are simply a reprojected version of the original. So that is the simple solution to that problem.
And I think it's always worth noting, David, as well, the option there to add loaded files. So kind of similar to what Jeff was just talking about, if you've maybe classified a bunch of LiDAR and you want to keep it in the same tiles, you can export it through this batch export and keep all those tiles, but now with a new updated classification.
Exactly. Thank you for that one, Kat. So yeah, easy solution here, easy solution. And you don't have to load them. That's the other thing, Kat, you don't actually have to load them for this to work. This isn't like an independent application. So. Okay, let's keep rolling here. Kat, we're going to throw this one over to you. There's actually two questions came in, variations on the theme of Global Mapper's interoperability. One was very specifically how compatible is Global Mapper with our ArcGIS, and then specifically about the GDB format. So, Kat, I believe you're just going to answer this one verbally. We don't need to share the screen.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, Global Mapper can export to a file geodatabase or a personal geodatabase. In version 21 is when we added the ability to do that in 64-bit for vector features without an Esri license. So that if you are running an older version, that might be a reason to take a look at some of our newest releases there. The 32-bit application also supports raster export. The raster export to GeoDatabase does require an Esri license on the machine. But yeah, for vector features, you will find that export option under the file menu under export to spatial database. And ArcSDE options are there as well. So that is also 32-bit for ArcSDE.
Excellent. So interoperability is key here. Obviously, people are shifting data back and forth, and we want to make sure that we play with everyone in the playground, to use that analogy. Thank you, Kat. A question came in through our questions panel here. Can you select an area and manually classify it and act specifically in the 3D view? The best way to do that is the profile view. And I think we're talking about point cloud data here. Somebody's asking about reclassifying selected points to be power lines, for instance. Yes, you can. You can do it using the automatic power line reclassification, but if you want to do it manually, running the profile through your point cloud, defining the swath width, it makes it much easier to select those above ground features, and then absolutely you've got full control over reclassifying those into whatever classification you want. So yes, the answer to that one is yes. Okay, this question came up obviously through our submitted questions. It also came up on our questions panel today, a question about break lines. Can you add break lines? It specifically says before generating contours, but this is actually something that we would initiate when we're creating the surface from which the contours would be generated. So it's kind of a two-step process. Jeff, I'm going to hand this one over to you. I'm actually going to give you the screen. Maybe you could do a quick show and tell of this function, the break line function.
Yes, sure. So what what we are looking at here is I have some LiDAR data loaded. This data is already classified at least to ground, so you can see all the brown points are ground. And then what I have are two vector features. I have one that represents a pond and one that represents a stream. What's important to note, anytime we need to use a vector feature as part of a break line, we sometimes call this process hydroflattening. It needs to be a 3D vector feature. And so if I use my feature info tool, I can see that, let's shut off my LiDAR here. I can see that my pond has an elevation value. And then for the stream, each vertex has an elevation value as well. So this line feature has per vertex elevations. And now when I have that data loaded, I can choose to incorporate it as part of my terrain creation process. So when I launch that tool, it's going to ask me to confirm which layers I want to use. So I'll use those 3 layers. And then the setting for that is our setting, our first checkbox down here that says use 3D area or line features as break lines. I can choose what sort of edge I want. So the larger value I put here, the smoother and larger the edge looks on the edge of my features. In this case, I'm not going to get into too many settings here. I'm going to use a binning method, and I'm going to create a terrain model or a DTM since we're just dealing with ground points. I could also choose to further filter just to ground, so I'm not using any points that aren't already classified as ground. And so I ran this a few separate times so we can see differences in our outputs. So let's first take a look at our pond. And I'll turn off my vector data here. So this first output terrain layer that we're looking at was not flattened. But if I take a look using my image swipe tool, I can see that the second layer I created was flattened. And there's a clear difference here comparing the layer that had been flattened to the one that had not. The same idea will apply to the stream, and we'll zoom in a little bit since the stream's a much smaller feature. In this case, my flattened stream happens to be on top, and we'll see as I swipe that off, we very much lose the definition of the stream because the bottom layer here was not flattened, but the top layer is flattened here. Another way I might like to look at this is quickly with my profile view. We'll see I have both of my layers displayed, so I can see my unflattened layer is highlighted in blue and the flattened stream is highlighted in red. We can very clearly see right here where that flattening was retained as part of the creation of my terrain layer. So then if we went on to generate contours or something of that nature, whatever our next steps would be, that would all be retained as part of those terrain features.
Okay, excellent, Jeff. So I guess, again, to reiterate, the process of applying break lines specifically to contours is done during the surface creation process. Thank you so much, Jeff. Let me grab the screen back. Next question. This was for Chris again. Someone is asking, this is, again, a common one we get. Someone's purchased a license to Global Mapper, spent some of their time in the office. Occasionally they go out into the field with a laptop. What's the process for moving a license, or what are their options for moving license? Chris, are you with us still?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. We also get that question quite a bit from time to time. So the easiest way to move a license from any machine to another machine is probably the USB dongle license option that we have, where we ship a license on a USB key, and you can actually remove it from one machine, take it to another machine, and then insert the license that way. But if you have a single user node lock license that you need to move from your desktop to your laptop machine, and it is in maintenance and support, you can request a reauthorization of that license, and there's a process that our license team can walk you through. Very recently, we came out with an RDP license option for folks to consider, especially now in these days, with most folks working from home. Our remote desktop license is something that we are making available for folks, and it's been quite well received. So but the main message here is, yes, you can definitely move licenses from desktops to laptops and back and forth in a variety of ways. So we are very flexible with our licensing.
Yeah, I mean, just that RDP has just literally happened this week, I believe. Chris, that was announced this week? Am I correct?
It was this. I think it was yesterday,
Yeah,
David.
it was
yesterday.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So that's literally hot off the presses. So yeah, no number of options. The dongle is really useful. You know, and not only sharing it with your desktop and laptop machine, but even sharing it with a colleague really quickly. Somebody wants to do something in Global Mapper. That dongle is a key that will let you do that. It basically activate the application on a specific machine. So it requires that little hardware key. So thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
Where are we going next? I will answer this one. Can the Pixels to Points tool be used to create a 3D model of the interior of a building? Now, the quick answer to that is no. Not with a lot of creativity, I guess is the qualifier. Let me bring up the application here so we can take a look. For those of you who don't know what Pixels to Points is, this is our tool for generating 3D data photogrammetrically from overlapping drone images. Now, what you're seeing on the screen, for those of you who haven't seen it before, are little icons representing the location from which a photo was taken by a drone. You can see the little arrows indicating the direction of travel as well. The Pixels to Points tool, part of our lidar module, is this little icon. I'm going to show you why it will not work in the scenario that was described. I'm going to load the picture points themselves. We're going to see these on my screen. The required elements that allow us to recreate or reconstruct the 3D environment are the latitude, the longitude, and the elevation. Knowing that for the location of the drone when the photo was taken, or specifically from the location of the camera, allows us to determine through triangulation where specific recognizable features are in an array of pixels in multiple images. Sorry, long explanation. So with an interior application, you're obviously not going to have that information. You can take images from multiple different directions, but without that 3D coordinate value, it will not be able to apply that reconstruction. So again, long answer to a short question. No, that's not what this tool is intended for. Next question. This actually pertains to something that was added fairly recently into Global Mapper. Jeff, I'm going to throw this one over to you, I believe. Is there a way to delete a specific label? And I'm going to assume that the person who asked this question is actually working on an older version of the application. So maybe you could show us very quickly how you can do that now.
Yeah, sure. So there is now new labeling functionality that was added to the application, I believe came out this past fall in version 21. What we're looking at here in Global Mapper is a tax parcels layer, and each of these features is labeled with an ID. I may need to do some sort of editing to certain ones or all of them, depending on my workflow. This is a very easy process. If I double click on the layer to get into my layer options, under the Labels tab, there is now an option to create separate label layer. What this allows me to do is separate those labels from the feature and have them in their own layer. I can further choose to work directly with the labels. Once this tool is enabled, I can select a label, I can move it around. I have the ability to edit the text. I can edit what it says, or I could edit its style. So perhaps I want to choose maybe a different typeface for this label. I could do that as well. I could also do that at the entire layer level. So if I had selected my entire layer, I could go in and make those adjustments as well. These are essentially treated as point features, so you can always choose to select and individually move them, or in this case, I selected all of them, so I can move them around as needed to reposition them and things like that.
Basically, by detaching the labels from the features themselves, it gives you full control over the display, the font, the orientation, the alignment, etc. So lots of different options in there. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Okay, how are we doing here, folks? We're about 25 minutes to go, and we have a stack of questions we want to try to get through here. Next one we got in through the inbox is, can the split function be used in generating map legend results? Kat, while we're shifting our screen to you, There was a question came in, which I will try to answer while you're bringing up your screen. Can I associate images to either points or lines in Global Mapper? Answer to that is yes, and time permitting, I'm going to show that one to you today. You can basically assign a file path as an attribute. Global Mapper will recognize that. When you click on that feature with the info tool, it will give you the option to pop up whatever that file is, be it an image or a PDF or a doc or whatever. So yeah, that is a yes to the yes answer to that question, and hopefully I'll have a chance to demonstrate that a little bit.
Yeah, there's also recognized attribute names for that linkage. But let's switch back to the question about splitting the attribute table. So I've got some actually Tiger data loaded, which has some nice kind of default styles. So I just grabbed that as a vector type that has a bunch of different features in it. I'm just going to generate a map layout here, and let's use my current screen bounds here. So we did add recently some changes to what you can include in the legend, including filtering it by things like which layer things are in. So I think this question is actually a little bit of an answer or an idea as well for some people. So actually I want a vector legend here. So I'm going to insert a map legend. So if I just include feature description, I have a lot of feature types here. Even if I just include only the data in my current map, I'm going to end up with a whole bunch of different things in my legend, and they actually are not even all going to fit in here. So a good idea here might be to split my layer into a bunch of sublayers. So I'm going to go back to my control center here. And if I choose the option here in the layer menu, I'm going to split this by the description. Which in this case is going to give me some kind of understandable subtypes within my census Tiger data here. Now when I go back to my legend here and go ahead and edit it, let's go to the properties here. So I can actually filter by the layer now. So I might want to include only a couple of these different things in my legend. So let's grab a couple of options here and go ahead and apply those. So now I have a limited amount of data, just what I want in my legend, kind of depending on what features I might want to include, and maybe not everything. Maybe some of these icons are kind of understandable on their own, or maybe not important to the purpose of my map. So yes, splitting the layer can really help you kind of narrow down that legend and just include in it specifically what you want, as well as those options to only include data in the current map bounds. And then if you want to kind of get fancier, you can make groups of layers and give them kind of subheadings. Like I could have all my points in one larger group, all my areas in another larger group, and the legend can get those options as well by using this layer and layer group option. So this is a recent addition. I think within the last year. I didn't write down exactly what version we added this, but this is a newer feature here that does really expand what you can do with the legend.
Oh, excellent. Thanks, God. And that whole map layout is something you might want to explore. Again, we know folks are still using a very old version of the software, some of the older versions. This is something that was added relatively recently. Worthwhile taking a look at that if you're doing any sort of map printing or map publishing. Okay, thank you so much. And again, I want to try to multitask. I want to try to switch my screen and answer a question. Someone asked a question about limiting the extent of specifically contours or gridding if they don't want a larger area. Is it possible to limit that? Yes, the answer is yes. Hold that thought for a second. I'll show you in just a minute when I bring up the application again. Most of the processes in Global Mapper, most of the analysis or data creation processes will have the option to define the extent. And it can be based on a polygon, it can be based on what's on your screen, et cetera, et cetera. So hold that one for this time being. The question we have now, which I'm going to address, is there is an option under the layer menu for a elevation layer to find the max min elevation values, but it does not place a point on the map. So someone was asking the question how they do that. Is it possible to plot the maximum minimum elevation within a defined area directly on the map? So let me take a look at that one. I bring up the application. Here we go. Let me first address the question that was asked, unrelated to the question I'm about to answer, but in terms of generating contours, you will always find a bounds tab in any of the analysis tools where you can define the extent. Common one is if you've got a polygon that you've defined as your target area, draw that polygon first or create that polygon or import that polygon, select it with a digitizer. This will be active. You can then limit the extent of whatever it is you're doing, in this case generating contours, to the extent of that polygon. So that's answering that question. Back to this question, I want to find the maximum minimum elevation within this area, within this area of terrain. The option that was described is an option in the layer menu. With the elevation layer selected, I can go to the layer menu here, and I can find extreme max min elevation values. What this does is it generates a report. You'll get the lat long and you'll get the elevation, and it allows you to save that externally. What it doesn't do is it actually put it on the map. So that's why the question was asked, how do I determine where that is? Yeah, we could manually turn that around and plot those points to find my max min. There are a couple of alternatives though. First is related to something I just previewed a second ago, the contour tool. I can generate contours. Included in the contour generation dialog box is the option to create spot height elevation points at the maximum minimum locations. We've recently also added the ability to find local spot heights, peaks, local peaks if you like. Just for this quick demo, I'm going to turn that off, but if I wanted to, for instance, identify each of these little peaks in my terrain based on the number of concentric contours, it would create those for me. I don't want that in this case, I just want the absolute max within my target area. You'll notice my contour interval set to 200 meters. The elevation range within this area is 120 meters. In other words, I'm not actually going to see any contours based on this setting, which is fine, because what I want to do is simply create these spot heights. I'm also going to do something I just mentioned a few minutes ago. I'm going to limit the extent, and I'm just going to show this related to the data that's on my screen. Everything else should be fine. We'll click OK. It's going to give me a warning. Well, technically, it found some contours off screen a little bit, I think the minimum contours. But bottom line here, I've got my max elevation, 122.8 meters as noted here. That's one method. Very quickly showing you another method. For this, I need to define the area of interest first. And what I'm going to do is simply draw a circle. Again, I know my max elevation is somewhere within this area. So having just drawn a circle, I'm just going to call this layer test. This is just a vector layer I'm generating just to hold this circle feature. I'm going to select the circle. Now I can run an analysis of the terrain characteristics enclosed within that area. Right-click, attribute style function, and calculate elevation slope stats. Now the reason this is an attribute function is because actually it will add these attributes to the circle, to that feature. It will also ask me if I want to find the max min elevations, which is the reason for the question. I'm going to say yes. I get a report going through all of the details of the elevation, the maximum elevation, where it is, the maximum slope, etc., etc. But most importantly for this workflow, I also get a little icon indicating the spot height at the highest elevation. So two ways of achieving what was asked for, either contouring or using this attribute additional function. Okay, moving along. Multiple variations on basically the same theme here. We were asked a few different questions related to bringing in point data. How do I take a list of coordinates and convert them? For example, I have point data that I need to convert from lat long to UTM. How do I load data from a text file? And how do I load data from specifically from a spreadsheet? So Jeff, I'm going to hand this one over to you to answer all three of those questions collectively.
Great. And I think we'll actually start with one of the bottom questions. So when we're talking about working with point data, the first thing we would probably do is think about how we want to load it into the application. Global Mapper can load from a variety of text formats, whether we're talking plain text files, CSVs, tab separated files, whatever the case may be. So if you're starting with something like an Excel spreadsheet, you'll just want to save that out as a CSV. And then anytime we are going to load one of those files into Global Mapper, we always want to take a look at it first as raw text, because we need to understand the structure of the file so we can tell Global Mapper how to load it. What's important for me to take away here, I can see that the first row is a header row, so it has column header information in it. I can also note that I start latitude first, then longitude, followed by a variety of attributes. It looks like the data is probably tab separated as well. So I'm just noting the structure of the data. When I go then to load it into Global Mapper, I'm prompted with our text file importer. And so I'm taking what I just saw and learned from reading the raw file and telling Global Mapper how the data is structured. So in this case, I only want to load point data. I could choose a variety of other options depending on how my data was saved in my text file. I know that my data was latitude first, so I will keep that as my setting. If you had a longitude value first, you could select that as well. I can leave my coordinate format here as default. The application will recognize the structure of the coordinates in the file. If I needed to skip any rows or columns, I could apply settings of that nature. I then have a variety of delimiters to choose from. In this case, we saw that it was tab, so I'll set that as tab. I could also choose auto detect if I wanted. Since I'm loading point features, I could go ahead and choose how I want to style this feature if I wanted to style it ahead of time. I actually may have a custom built hydrant, so why not go ahead and set that. And then these last few settings on the bottom right here can be very important. So in this case, I have attribute data after my coordinates, so I want to include that. I'll keep my first checkbox enabled. Also asks if I have column headers in my data. I do, so I want to recognize those, but I don't have any elevation values. So I'm not going to choose to have any elevation data automatically recognized and loaded from this file. If you ever had any advanced fly-through work, it's worth noting that that data can be saved in a text file and Global Mapper can recognize it from there. Once the data loads, I'm going to be asked what projection or what coordinate system information is associated with this file, because again, a text file doesn't store any of that in any sort of metadata. It was geographic coordinates, so I will leave this as is. And my points will now display on my map. So we would have noticed that when looking at the original file, the data was just in geographic coordinates, latitude, longitude. If I wanted to change that, I could do so a few different ways. So by default, my workspace is going to have a projection associated with the first file that was loaded. In that case, that happened to be some imagery, and that imagery was in a Minnesota County coordinate system. So that is how everything is displayed on my screen right now. If I wanted to, I could directly export this text file, and when I did so, it would retain whatever my configuration and display projection is. Oftentimes, though, we often need to have our coordinates as attributes, which by default they are not. They're loaded as the geometry of the feature. So if I wanted to add them as attributes, all I would have to do is select the layer. I can then right-click on the map and go back into my attribute menu that David was just in and choose to add coordinates or bounds to my selected features. When I do this, I'll be prompted of the success. And if I were to take a look at my attribute table, we'll now see that I have X and Y attributes pertaining to the projected coordinates for each given point. So these values will always be based on whatever your current global projection is. I could choose to save just the attribute table out as a CSV if I only needed to work with it this way, or if I chose to export at this point, these would be retained as new attributes as part of that file. So kind of a few different ways to get to the same result depending on what you need to accomplish there.
Excellent, Jeff. Thank you so much. I think we have a time for a few more. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly here. And again, with apologies for those of you who haven't had your questions answered. I know a lot of questions coming in through the questions panel. We will follow up with you and get you answers to those as well. Kat, I think this is just another verbal answer rather than a demo. Someone would like to know the best workflow for exporting raster file, tiling the image, and leaving the background transparent. Maybe you can answer that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is sort of a two-part question. Let's talk about transparency first. So only certain raster formats are going to support transparency. So we'd recommend something like a GeoTIFF. You want to find the option make background void pixels transparent. You can also do transparency with things like ECW and JPEG 2000. But Global Mapper does create an alpha channel to do that transparency, which is not something that every application recognizes for that file format. So GeoTIFF is a little bit more universally accepted. There are other formats that can do transparency as well. But yeah, take a look at, if you see that option, make background void pixels transparent, then that file format can support transparency. When you go to export, there is an option for tiling. So you can tile kind of splitting up your extent into, sort of a regular grid, or you can use selected vector features. If you are tiling and you want kind of seamless edges, I will also point you to some settings in the configuration around export and sample spacing. So you have to remember that when we're creating rasters, we are basically in kind of Lego space. We can't cut the Legos in half. So there's some settings around basically if you're going to shift the pixels or slightly make them slightly smaller or slightly bigger to kind of align perfectly with those bounds, or you can also kind of grow the edge so that they overlap a little bit extra. But there are kind of a lot of options for how you make those tiles sort of perfectly align based on the settings that you've set for sample spacing, your pixel resolution and your bounds, etc.
Okay, first time I've ever heard Lego be mentioned in one of my webinars. That's a first. Duly noted. Duly noted. Oh, good. Thank you, Kat. Someone asked a question, and this is coming in the questions panel. Is it possible to remove the default point line area types from configuration? Answer to that is yes. I'm going to show you something unrelated, but as an intro to that, I will answer that question specifically. Let's move on. Next question. When importing a shapefile, a lot of people are referring to workflows with shapefiles, obviously. When importing a shapefile into Global Mapper, why do I lose text labels? Worth noting why some layers that you import have labels and why some layers do not. It's quite simple. Before I get to that, to answer the question came in the questions panel, how do I adjust the, or filter, essentially, filter the list of feature types. Under vector display, you'll note filter right here. Areas, this is all the feature types that are embedded in the application with checkboxes that can be unchecked as necessary. Same with lines, same with points. I would warn you, people tend to get a little bit over eager with this, and they will remove specific feature types that are required in the application. For instance, the unknown feature type, unknown point style, unknown line style, are needed if there's no other style assigned. And I've had situations personally where I loaded in a shapefile and it did not appear on the map, and simply because I'd removed that particular feature type. But to answer the question, yes, you can filter out the feature types that you don't need. Obviously, you can add your own as well. So back to the question at hand about labels. I'm going to bring in two separate layers here to show the difference. I've got a parcels layer here, just a small sample. You'll note importing the parcels, they're not labeled. There's no labels assigned. I'm going to bring in another layer, and this is some roads. And this is, again, two shapefiles. You will note that the roads are labeled. Why? Why is the roads labeled and the parcels not labeled? Well, that's basically down to the structure of the attribute table, specifically what the attributes are called. The roads, if I use my info tool, include an attribute called full name. That is recognized by Global Mapper as being a label. It could be name, it could be label as well. There are variations on this, but if it identifies that within the attribute table, it will elevate that to be the name that's assigned and ultimately the label that's displayed on the map. That's why we have an attribute, or a label for our roads, and conversely, that's why we don't automatically have an attribute for these parcels, because there is no identifiable label assigned in the attribute table. Now, that's not to say we can't add our own label. We could take any attribute or any combination of attributes, and just using the options for that layer, we could create our own labels. We can basically create labels from a single attribute or from multiple attributes. So you do have that option, but the default is going to be, the behavior by default is going to be based on those names that are assigned. So hopefully that answers that question, quite a simple one. Got about 5 minutes, maybe time for a couple more here. Is there a simple way to add a point to a known lat long? Is this one yours, Kat? I believe you're going to try to answer this one.
Let's stick with your screen.
Okay.
I don't know if you need to show this, but yes, it is possible to do that. Yeah, so the digitizer, in the context menu there, if you want to right click on the map, there is an option under point features for point at position. This is going to pop up a dialog that lets you create a point at the specified location. Pretty simple there, pretty simple. Yeah, so this overrides. Yep, type in your coordinates. This actually, yep, this also works with a GPS unit, actually. Not everyone knows that you can plug a GPS unit into your computer and actually take points on Global Mapper desktop. So you'd get a little extra option in this dialog as well if you had a GPS plugged in. Excellent. And also you can put a z-value noted here. So yeah, simple solution. I think the second part was what about multiple points? We've already talked about that. Jeff went through a fairly lengthy
workflow about adding multiple points from a text file. Obviously, that text file delimited structure allows you to do that as well. Next, noticed while creating contours from lidar that some of the contours intersect. That's a big no-no. That should not happen, and actually cross. Maybe Jeff, you could help explain why and how to prevent that.
Sure. So
I'm not sure if you've got anything to show, but just
I don't at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. No worries.
But so in general, contours should never cross. Newer versions of Global Mapper should have a catch to prevent this, but most likely what is causing this is, especially if you're working in an older version, if when you're designing your contour or setting up your contour generation tool, if your simplification value is oversimplified, you're probably seeing that cause lines to cross because it's just connecting certain point to points, and those points may cross each other. So you'll want to check your simplification setting when generating contours. Otherwise, newer versions of the app should prevent that from happening.
Yeah, so it's an automatic process now. So excellent. One of the questions we did get with apologies we won't have a chance to answer, so further down in our list here, is the difference between simplify and smooth. Two different geometric editing tools can be applied to line features, including contours. I'll give you a quick description of what they are without obviously having the time to go through the demo. Simplification removes unnecessary pixels. Basically, it looks for redundancy and allows you to establish that lateral threshold as to which which vertices can be removed. Smoothing does the opposite. Smoothing will add additional vertices to create a smooth line. So that's two variations on the theme. Again, with apologies, we won't have a chance to demonstrate that one today. I think we'll answer one more. And this I'm going to take. I have a layer with points with an attribute consisting of a link to an image file. How do I activate the link to display the image? Let me actually bring up another workspace. I should have been ready for this one. More apologies. I have a quick demo here of some data that actually has links already embedded, and we'll show initially how we activate the link and then how we can add them ourselves. So basically we have a little point on the map here. This point has a link to an image. Now this would happen automatically if you brought in a geotagged image, for instance from your cell phone, and you dropped it on Global Mapper. It will actually manually place it, automatically place it at the correct location. How do I access the image? That's with the info tool. Info tool, as we know, provides access to the attributes for a feature, but if it recognizes a file path, it will give you the option to decide what to do with that file path. You can either open it in Windows, in other words, it will open it in the default application that you have for opening that file, Word or Acrobat or whatever, or you can open it in Global Mapper if it's a supported format. You can actually load a file using this as well. I'm going to open it in Windows. We'll click OK, and from off screen, and just drag in my image viewer, and we have a picture of a house. I don't believe this is actually the house, but it's a fake house. But that's how the process works. How do we set it up? Well, I'm going to create another point here. Just going to drop a point on the map. In this dialog box, you will note the option, obviously we talked about this in a different context, to assign attributes, including the option to add a file, link to a file. And I'm going to go through this right now. I'm going to add a different picture of a house. And what is done here is it's actually defined the path right here on my local desktop to that file. It's also given it a name. This can be edited, by the way. It doesn't have to be called file link 1. You can make it photo 1 or photo whatever. I'm going to add another one because part of the question that came in actually was a little bit longer. It's like, what if I've got multiple files? Let's add an image of the interior of the house as well. And now you'll see two files essentially linked to that point. How does that work? Well, once again, using the info tool, it will recognize the fact that there are links and now gives me the option to open link 1 or link 2. Now, obviously, if I name these more appropriately, or rather than just file link 1, file link 2, I would know which of the files I was actually loading. So we'll go ahead and choose our file link 2. Again, from off screen, that's triggered the display of that file. Now, we're using it for images in this context. Needless to say, it can be used for any type of data, any format of data, assuming it can be loaded on your machine. Which brings us, unfortunately, to the end of our session today. And with apologies for those who were asking questions, we didn't get a chance to answer all of your questions. We will, as I mentioned, follow up with the answers. We'll have our tech crew answer all those questions for you. So look out for an email coming sometime next week. Let me go ahead and bring up some contact information for us so we can wrap this up. Just 1 second. There we go. So here's some email addresses if you want some more information. Chris was here. Thank you, Chris, for your input on some of those licensing questions. If you have any other questions on licensing or the purchase process, orders@bluemarblegeo.com. If you have additional questions, perhaps watching the recording of this, maybe questions about some of our workflows, feel free to email us at geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com. And if there are those on the line who are new to Global Mapper, we do encourage you to try it out. We obviously just scraped the tip of the iceberg today in terms of functionality. Download a trial. You can activate it for 2 weeks and put it through its paces and get a feel for how it works. I would like to thank Jeff and Kat for their assistance today. Good to have you here. I know we're in the midst of a release, so you guys are very busy. Thanks for taking the time to help us today.
Yes, you're welcome, David.
Thanks,
Nice chatting with you.
And thank you, Chris, once again, as always, for giving your expertise as well. And for the rest of you, thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to joining you again next week as we talk about Global Mapper Mobile.